So it's actually quite funny. I didn't get invested and involved in this issue out of any altruistic motives of my own. I was writing for Oxfam, social justice articles, and a particularly pretty girl told me that her mother took people to Villawood Detention Centre in Sydney to visit asylum seekers. And I remember saying, "Oh yeah, I'm heaps interested in asylum seekers. I'd love to go." And I had this idea that by schmoozing the mother, I could somehow get to the girl, and that was essentially my reasons for going to Villawood. Prior to going to Villawood, I had no real knowledge of the asylum seeker debate. I'd heard what I'd heard in the newspapers, and that was that asylum seekers were queue jumpers, they were cheating a system, what they did was illegal, and that there were people worse placed in refugee camps in Africa that needed our protection. And so going there, I guess I had an open mind, but quite naive. And so when I arrived at Villawood Detention Centre, I realised that it was a prison. There was barbed wire fences and security gates and security guards. And the first man I met was a Sri Lankan man, a Tamil, and he had rope burns around his neck. And he'd been given a negative ASIO security clearance and been told he wasn't going to be accepted as a refugee into Australia. And he was going to be deported back to Sri Lanka. And he decided that he would rather attempt suicide than return to the country that he'd fled from. And it was at this point I realised that I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, and that I had no real connection with these people and no way of speaking to them. I didn't know what I would say to the next man. And he was a Tamil Sri Lankan, about my age, so I thought the only thing I could really associate with him is with girls. I said, do you have a girlfriend? And he said, I did have a girlfriend, and she was murdered in Sri Lanka by the government. And so I spent a few hours in Villawood Detention Centre talking to Tamil men from Sri Lanka, Rohingyan Muslims from Burma who were being oppressed by the Buddhist majority, Iraqi men fleeing from the aftermath of a war that decimated their country, Hazara men from Afghanistan and Pakistan who were fleeing from racial and religious persecution, and Iranians who were fleeing from homosexual oppression and religious persecution as well. And their stories differed in detail, but not in tragic circumstance. According to them, they were fleeing from these types of oppression, and they were leaving families behind, and wives were murdered, mothers raped, things like this. And leaving that camp, I was given a bit of information to think on. The woman I went with, the mother of this very pretty girl, she told me that Australia had signed the United Nations Refugee Convention that gave us the obligation to protect refugees, a convention that was signed in the aftermath of World War II, when the Jews were fleeing Germany and were denied protection by the surrounding countries. And this convention stated that these people could flee to countries to seek protection, irrespective of which way they were travelling, whether it be across borders, by planes, or by boats. Whichever way they could get it away from that persecution, countries who signed the convention had an obligation to protect them. What struck me most about this detention in Villawood was that it was indefinite. For all these people's tragic stories, what was hardest for them was that they didn't know when they could leave and what would happen to them while staying in Villawood Detention Centre. So essentially their days were made up of endless games of ping pong. I walked away from that day at the detention centre and I wrote an article. And from there I wrote a few more articles, but I didn't really become involved in the asylum seeker debate until 6 months later. The Gillard government had set up an expert panel to decide what we could do about all these boats crashing at sea and people drowning. And the idea was that we were saving lives at sea by reintroducing the Pacific solution. However, at the same time, there was this contradictory policy called the no advantage policy, which was essentially saying that these people were getting advantage by coming by boat over those who were waiting in United Nations refugee camps. And so it was with this contradictory, definition of the policy that the Pacific solution was reintroduced. A friend of mine told me that the Salvation Army were hiring people to go to Nauru and act as humanitarians. And so she gave me a number and I decided to call it. And I think the reasons why I called were based on this sense of adventure and a sense of curiosity. I remember only a few hours in Villawood had left me emotionally exhausted and drained. And now I was going to be going to Nauru, where I'd be spending at least 4 weeks working for the Salvation Army in these camps. And what struck me most about my time in Villawood was that although I didn't know much about the policy, I knew there was a grave injustice being served to these men because their refugees determinations weren't being processed. And yet here I was deciding to go off to Nauru with the Salvation Army. And so I called this number that she gave me, and I said, the woman said yes, and I said, I'd like to go to Nauru. And she said, okay, when can you leave? And so a week later, I was flying to Nauru. I wasn't given a job description. I wasn't given a job interview. I wasn't given any kind of understanding of the people that I'd be working with and the structure of the camp. There was no cultural awareness training. We were literally put on a plane and sent to Nauru. I think this was this policy was implemented by the Salvation Army because everything was so rushed. And it was a knee-jerk reaction to having their contract signed in Nauru. And so when I arrived at the airport and met my first colleagues for the Salvation Army, I remember thinking, who am I going to be working with? Am I going to be working with retirees who are going to try and convert me to Christianity? And the first man I met was wearing a safari suit. The next woman I met didn't know what an asylum seeker was. And the third person I met was an 18-year-old. So it was with this ragtag group of, I described it as misfits because we were from all walks of life, very different understandings of the world, but all with this lack of education about asylum seekers and refugees. When we arrived in Nauru, I remember one of the men described it to me as they thought they were landing on water, because Nauru is such a small island that the plane actually envelops it as it comes in. It's 20 minutes around by car, and there's only 10,000 local inhabitants. Around the outer edges, it's quite a beautiful island. There's paradise beaches, coconuts and palm trees and beautiful waves. But as you move towards the centre, you start to realise just how poor this island is. And it's a republic that relies on Australian aid to fund it and to support it. There's very little infrastructure, no produce, and the island is dotted with these abandoned phosphate refineries from back in the days when Nauru was a great nation with a lot more money. When you see that the Australian government are offering $2 billion to house a few hundred asylum seekers on the island, it's a no-brainer for the Nauruan government to take this money and take this policy on board. As you move closer to the centre, you get to the mined-out phosphate rock. And it's quite a barren landscape, and it's very, very hot. Over 40 degrees, the humidity is very high, and that's where the regional processing centre was housed. For the workers arriving in Nauru, the conditions can only be described as oppressive. We were told we weren't allowed to email our loved ones anything back home, that the ASIO would be checking our emails. We weren't even allowed to say what kind of food we'd be eating inside the camp. And ASIO would, if we were found to be emailing back home, then would be sacked. We signed confidentiality deeds, and we signed contracts that say we would not talk to anyone about anything in the camp for all time. We were told not to make political statements on Facebook or Twitter, and people were fired for making political statements. The accommodation we were housed in was about 10 people to a room when I first arrived, with one toilet, all doing shift work. So it was actually quite a lot of fun for the first week because you met a lot of new people, but then as you got more tired and more tired from the type of work you were doing, it became quite exhausting. And as the camp progressed over the months that I worked there, it did get better, but even at the end I was still sleeping 4 people to a 2-bedroom. However oppressive it was for us, it was nothing compared to what the men suffered. The camp itself is a very small enclosed area in the middle of this mined-out phosphate rock. It's shale terrain. The men were housed in dark green army tents that reached 50 degrees during the middle of the day, at the hottest period of the day, and flooded in the wet season up to at least the knees in some areas. Within these army tents, they slept on stretcher beds on wooden pallet floorboards. These stretcher beds would have been 6 or 8 people to a tent. And in terms of temporary accommodation, you could probably, with you could probably stand it. It wasn't too bad. But in terms of long-term accommodation, it was just another factor in making this place really quite hard for the men. What struck me about the camp immediately was that there was no resources. The tents were rudimentary at best. The whole organisation of this camp was based around making it as difficult as possible for these people. The idea of taking people and knowing that you're going to send hundreds of men to an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and having no facilities there to make it worthwhile for them and make it bearable for them can only be described as premeditated. What's hardest of all is when they arrived and there was nothing to do, and the first questions they asked us was, how long will we be here for? When can we leave? Why are we here? And it was at that point that I realised I had no idea what I was doing there, and I had no answers for them. And so these men, really, that was the essential part of what makes this so bad. If you give a criminal a sentence, he has 5 years, say, he can look forward to when he'll leave. He'll have 5 years' time, he can tell his family, I'll be out, and he can plan his future. When you have no sentence, every day feels like the same. There's no progress from day to day. You can't tick off a box and say 364 days to go. And in this type of conditions, it becomes a breeding ground for mental illness. The men I met there came from all sorts of backgrounds, and they taught me a lot. The Tamil men from Sri Lanka, fleeing from this civil war in Sri Lanka and the aftermath of the civil war, they taught me that prejudice doesn't necessarily mean fear of death. It means being made to feel less than who you are, made to feel less than human. When they wanted to leave an area of their country, of their homeland, they'd have to go through a checkpoint with the army. When they went to the police or the hospital, the officials would speak in Sinhalese, not in Tamil. If they had an argument with a Tamil man, a Sinhalese man, and the policeman was Sinhalese, then who's he going to believe? The Sinhalese man. They talked of kidnappings, of the secret police chasing after them for suspected affiliation with the Tamil Tigers. They told me that the Tamil Tigers often conscripted men and demanded money to protect them. So when the government went after them saying, you helped the Tamil Tigers, well, of course they did. They were forced to. And so they were fleeing from the suppression on one side and the previous forced assistance for the Tamil Tigers on the other. And this is a country that our government has now given boats to stop them leaving and are trying to screen them out, saying that these people are not being oppressed, while the rest of the world are saying that they are. The Hazara men from Afghanistan told me that they'd never lived in a country that had been at peace. They were born to bombs and gunfire. The Iraqi men told me of the militia that would go through and the mayhem of you didn't know who you could trust and who you couldn't. So, coming from the background that I have, a 24-year-old white Australian male who'd only ever lived in a country that was at peace, this was quite a rude shock to me. And then seeing the conditions they were placed in, I realised it was something that I had to do. And while I was there, I set up a recreations program. I saw that they needed something to do to occupy their minds. And I knew that by giving them cricket competitions and music concerts and soccer competitions and excursions outside of the camp, maybe that could provide them some relief from the day-to-day boredom of the camp. And seeing them get outside that camp, you could instantly see them transform. It only took 5 minutes from leaving those gates to see them smiling and dancing and singing and to see their real characters come out. And within the camp, they were depressed, angry, guilt-ridden men. I began writing this book when I started to see the first signs of mental illness. It only took a few weeks before the first suicide attempts. And over my time, my 8 months in Nauru, I saw self-harm in the way of slashed wrists, sewn lips using blunt paper clips, cigarette burns. I saw suicide attempts. Men used cords from tents, threatened to jump off cliffs, bed sheets, whatever way they could. I saw hunger strikes, thirst strikes, peaceful protests, riots, the inevitable riots that arise when all other avenues of protest have been exhausted and the men still aren't hearing their claims. And I saw men go crazy and be taken back to Australia to be treated in mental health hospitals. And so the first time I began writing was after a particular incident with a man I knew from Iran. He was a Kurd, and he said he was stateless, which means he was not recognised by any state and has no claim to a home. And he'd fled from Iran to seek protection and a better life for his family. And that term, better life, has now been, vandalised and used as a way of saying that these people are just seeking a better life. That's essentially what we all do, and that's the basis of the first steps of being a refugee, is seeking a better life for your family. And so he came to Australia, and his family didn't understand why he was kept in Nauru, and they couldn't understand why he wasn't in Australia and why he had taken their money and run away. And so they told him that he'd taken their money and he wasn't coming back and they were leaving him. And so essentially he found himself in the middle of nowhere with no hope and no idea of where he was going or what was happening to him, with no family. And so he attempted to take his life using one of the cords from the army tents. And this was just 3 weeks in. And I went into the camp to talk to his friends and I guess to grieve with them. And it was only then, because we'd been told we had to go out and be their friends, and we embraced this and we really did our utmost for them. And it was only going in after this suicide attempt that I realised that we weren't their friends. We were their jailers and their caseworkers and the professionals that worked within these camps while these men were kept within the camps. And the divide was erected, and the men accused me of it being my fault and saying that I'd caused this man to attempt suicide. And at that point in time, there was nothing I could do and nothing I could think and say that would suggest otherwise, because essentially this was our government and our policies and our people's decision to send these people to these far-off islands and house them indefinitely and not process their refugee claims. And so it was that point that I was bearing the forefront of their guilt and anger and frustration. And that was essentially the role of the Salvation Army workers there. And whatever I say about the organisations and the way this camp was run, the people that were continually on the forefront of that emotion deserve the utmost respect, because it was a very difficult job. And after seeing that, I walked out of the camp, and it was a horrible feeling, because I knew these men who were suffering so much couldn't come with me. They were stuck there, and there was no end in sight for this pain. And that was really, I had to walk out of that camp at that point because it was too painful for me. And so I went back to my room in the hotel, and I wrote out this chapter, and it hasn't changed since. And from there I began to record the really emotional periods for me in the camp. And then going back to Australia and being disconnected and feeling disconnected and not being able to relate to Australians and my friends, and them asking me, how was Nauru? And I'd say, good. I realised at one point one of my friends read this book, the writings that I had, and he had more pertinent questions and he seemed to understand, and I realised that through my writings I'd have a window into this dark and mysterious world, this closed-off world where media is banned and the United Nations are banned and Amnesty are banned, and the Australians aren't allowed to look in. And through these writings, I hope that Australians can see what's happening and what the reality of a deterrence policy is. Because essentially, whatever side of politics you sit on, this isn't about left or right. This is about human rights. And for whatever reasons they give, whether it be save lives at sea, stop the people smugglers, we decide who'd come to these shores and how they come, stop terrorists. We have more deserving people in Africa. There are refugees in this camp. The statistics say 90% of these people are refugees. And we are placing them in detention immediately without any processing of their claims. Of all the men I worked with in Nauru, since they arrived, which was almost 2 years ago, not one person has had their refugee status processed. So if we're so valiant and this is such a great policy, why aren't we hearing their claims and why aren't we processing these people? And I hope that with this book, at least people will understand what the reality of a deterrence policy is, so then they can make an informed decision rather than being told the lies and misconceptions and mistruths that proliferate the debate about asylum seekers.